Hello. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to make this office carpet substance material. So as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. It's just like this checkered office carpet with like some wear and tear and a little bit of dirt that's kind of like rubbed in. So yeah, without further ado, let's just jump right into the graph. It's not overly complicated. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it's pretty simple in terms of materials. Before we begin, I'm just gonna say that I am using Substance Designer 5.6.1. So I don't know. I don't keep up with like exactly every single change with Substance Designer. So some things might be different, but I'm not using anything that like was introduced in the latest Substance Designer or anything. So you probably will be able to follow along. Also, as you can see, I put all my noises up on this top row up here, and then I just reference each one, again and again, instead of like bringing the same noise in like 3 or 4 times. I find this helps make the graph like compute a lot faster, which is nice. You don't have to do this, but I do because it's just the quickest way to get your material to compute. So yeah, let's just start with the base pattern. And because this is carpet, we're going to be using fibers 2. And I'm just using the default node, nothing changed on it. And then what I'm doing is I'm bringing it into transform 2D node. And I just hit divide a bunch of times, this divide by 2 button, until I got something, about the size that I wanted. You can probably determine how big you want yours to be. And then what I'm doing is I brought in dirt 4, and I'm using that as a slope in a slope blur grayscale. And then obviously the grayscale is the output from the transform 2D. I'm using 16 samples, not 32. Actually, I'll show you what happens if we use 32. See, it gives a little bit different effect than what I want. 16 makes it a bit more noisy, which kind of represents like the fibers that like the row of carpet might have, kind of like this, which is the look I'm going for. So yeah, in the slope blur grayscale, we're going with like a really low intensity, like 0.01, and we're setting the mode to min. And this is actually like way too noisy for my taste. So what we're doing is we're just blending it back on top of the transform 2D node. And as you can see, it's like, it's still noisy, it still looks fibrous, but it's much more subdued, much more manageable, and that's what we're going for. Okay, so then we're going to get into like what I call pattern warping, which is like, manipulating the pattern to give it like more of a carpety feel. So we're using another slope blur grayscale, and our slope this time is going to be clouds 3. And our samples are at 32, intensity at like 0.01, and mode at min. And then I'm just running it through levels to just brighten it up a little bit. And then I am using transform 2D, and what I'm doing here is I'm squishing it vertically. I'm sure there's a better term for that, but basically what I felt is like, there's a lot of space between each row, and each row is actually like really thick. And so I thought it would look better if things were there were more lines vertically. So that's how I accomplished that. Then we're running it through another warp node. Excuse me, not another warp node. This is our first warp node. And our gradient input for warp node will be fractal sum 4. It's at a pretty low intensity, like 0.01. And then we're using another warp node, also at 0.001. And that is using black and white spots too. And then finally, another warp node with Perlin noise 1 at like 0.1 intensity. Excuse me, I had to take a drink. And what all of these do is it just kind of adds a bit of noise, like fibery noise, to the carpet to make it feel more like a carpet that's been walked on, or something that has had something placed on it, so to speak. So then to get our carpet tiles, we're using a tile sampler node. This is a bit more complicated than the other sampler nodes, but I'll walk you through it, and we're not doing anything too crazy with it. So to get the tiles, we're going to adjust our X and Y amount, which I've exposed, and I'll explain why I did that in a minute. At the moment it's set at 6 by 6, but you can use whatever you want. Our pattern is going to be set to pattern input. Pretty straightforward there. Scale is set to 1, precisely 1. If you set it any higher or lower, it won't look right. Like if you set it to like 0.99 or 0.98, there'll be like a little black gap between there, and you don't really see that on carpet. Carpet's pretty seamless, and if you set it to like anything over 1, then they overlap, and again, carpet tiles like this don't really do that. So we're not gonna go in that direction. And then to get it to rotate, I'm actually using a rotation map. And well, I might as well explain that now. A rotation map is simply a tile generator. And a tile generator that has its X and Y number also exposed, so it matches with this tile sampler. And if you're unfamiliar, I'll just clear this real quick. If you're unfamiliar, all you have to do is just you have to click this little white sine wave box, and then you just choose you would choose expose. You'd give it a name, input name. I've already made mine. And then you say, okay. And then it's exposed. And then all you do is just go to the same, click the sine wave for the other parameters, and then just click the same name that you gave before. And that'll make sure that like everything matches. So when I have this parameter here, I can just adjust, like, say I want 4, and then they all update. So that's pretty cool. So that's why I'm doing it. But I like 6, so we're going to stick with that. So anyways, this tile sampler with the X and the Y exposed, and then our scale is at 1. And we're using square as our pattern input type. And most important of all, we're using a checker mask. You can kind of control, I'll show you this a bit later on, but we're actually using this checker mask not only for rotation, but we're also using it to control like where our colors are, where the different color tiles are being placed. And I just went with like a simple checker pattern. But you can switch it up. Like if you want like different colors, you could go like that, or you could go like that. That's probably not going to look very good, but you could do something like this if you wanted, But we're going to stick with checker. Yeah, there it goes. Just was a little slow updating. So okay, yeah, right. Back to our tile sampler. We're using this tile generator as our rotation mask. And the way this rotation mask works is it's saying, where there's a white tile, don't do anything. Where there's a black tile, do something. And what it's doing is where there's a black tile, it's saying rotate 0.25 times, which is 90 degrees. And so that's exactly what's going on here. So we have a black tile here, and it's rotated 90 degrees, whereas we have a white tile here, and it's not doing anything. Oh, okay, excuse me, I had that backwards. So, okay, where there's a white tile, rotate 90 degrees. Where there's a black tile, do nothing. So, yeah, that actually makes more sense. But you get my point. Right, so from here, we're taking it into a blend node, and we're going to blend some wear on top of it. And to get our wear, we're going to use a fractal sum base, and we're going to play with the settings a little bit. Crank the roughness up to 2, the min level to 9, and the max level to 7. And we're going to run it through a blur with intensity 3. So not a blur high quality grayscale. We don't actually want to use that in this case, and I'll show you why. So blur high quality grayscale is really neat because it gets rid of a lot of like the artifacts that the blur node uses. But in this case, we actually want to keep those artifacts. And I'll show you why. So here it is with using our blur node with all the artifacts. And if we plug in the blur high quality grayscale, you can see it just changes ever so slightly. And I personally like the look of the blur node with all the artifacts in there because it creates all these imperfections, which makes sense because it's like wear, it's supposed to be imperfect. So okay, what we're doing then with this blur is we are blending it on copy, and what we want to do is we just want to take a little bit of this noise out. And what I'm doing is I'm using a fractal sum, I'm using a Perlin noise zoom, and I'll get to that a little bit later. and I'm just cranking the levels to get a mask. I'm just kind of clamping this to get a mask, and then that's kind of what I end up with. And then we're running this through a histogram scan with contrast set on 1 and position set about halfway. You can kind of play with this. The more white you bring in, the more wear that's going to be brought on to your carpet. And I found this was about right. So out of that histogram scan, we're going into a warp node. And for our gradient input on the warp node, we're using this fractal sum 4 again. And we just want a really low intensity, like 0.03, excuse me. And what this is doing is it's just kind of breaking up these edges, again, kind of making it like look imperfect. And then we're going to bring that warp into a directional warp. And for our intensity input, it's going to be the output from our tile sampler. And as you can already see, that's what this is doing is it's making it look like this is worn into our carpet. You can see that like these horizontal or vertical noise lines, like that matches what we have on this carpet here. So that's pretty cool. And then out of this directional warp, we're blending that on top with subtract at about 50%. And 50% might actually not be right. You're going to have to play with this a little bit. You don't want it to be fully black. You want it to be like, just have like a tiny little bit of the carpet underneath coming through. Because if it's totally black, then it ends up being like totally smooth. Well, let me disable the other wear here for a minute, and I'll show you what I mean. So yeah, here we go. So as you can see, okay, wait, let me go back to this blend node. So as you can see, we have a little bit of the carpet peaks coming through, but if we totally drown them out, you can see it's like it's just completely smooth, which looks really weird. Like I guess maybe the carpet is really, really worn down, but probably not. Probably there's still like little pieces of carpet, kind of like this. So using this opacity slider, you can kind of control like how worn down you want your carpet to be. Even if you don't want it like worn down that much, you can just go like that, and it's just, it's very subtle. It's a very subtle effect. Like, maybe this is part of like a really busy office, and there's like lots of people who walk through it every day. It's not decrepit, but it's just used. But for our purposes, we're going to keep this about half, and we're going to turn the secondary wear back up. The sub-carpet, as I call it. I didn't really know what to call that, but... So yeah, okay, back on topic here. What we're doing is then we're going to take this directional warp, but we're going to pass it through levels. We're just going to clamp it a little bit, and we're going to run it through a blur high-quality grayscale, and we're going to use that as a mask for this blend node. And we're going to use it a few other times, too, coming up. So then we're going to get on to our... I call it sub-carpet. I don't really know what else to call it. Kind of a weird question, but I don't know how many of you have like actually looked at like carpet and like looked underneath like what holds carpet together. But there's kind of like this weave kind of pattern that they stick, they stick the fibers through and kind of like weave the carpet into there. And that's kind of like how carpet's held together. Is it's kind of woven together through this kind of mesh fabric, for lack of a better term. And so that's what I wanted to represent here. Is like maybe the carpet is so worn down that it's gotten down to this sub carpet. Again, you can disable this if you want. Like if you think it's too much. I mean, like I showed you before. But I thought it was a nice touch. And so I'm accomplishing that with Weave 3. And I'm setting it to like 256 tiling, which is pretty small, but you can play around with it yourself. Maybe you want it smaller or bigger, whatever. I'm running that through a slope blur grayscale, and the slope is going to be clouds 3. I'm using 32 samples, intensity at 0.1, and the mode is set on min. Then I'm outputting that into a histogram range. I'm taking the values really low, making it like really dark, and then I'm blending it on top of our previous node, using max lighten. And I've exposed the opacity here. And I've also exposed the opacity for this node, and those two actually are controlled by the same parameter. And that's just if I want to like totally get rid of this effect, I can do that. But I'll get to that when we get into the color. Right, and then I'm also using our blur high quality grayscale as a mask here. I don't know if that's actually necessary, but I'm doing it just for the sake of sanity, I suppose. Right, then we'll get into like some large warping, and you can already see the difference here. It's kind of you know, maybe these tiles have been walked on a lot, and you know they kind of stretch and contort, you know, as they get used. So you know, again, you can kind of control this effect if you like it or if you don't like it. And what we're doing is we're just warping it with our Perlin noise zoom. Intensity I also exposed because these two have to be controlled together, like in parallel. So I forget what I actually set it at. Okay, it's actually set at 1, which might be a little bit high. You know, maybe like a more subtle effect is better, because if you go like too high, it's, you know, it can be kind of like unrealistic. Like maybe you wouldn't see this so much. Like that's pretty crazy. But you know, like 0.25 might be better. Okay, and then we're taking our tile generator from before, and we're also directionally warping this exactly the same as this. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to need this to perfectly match what's going on here when we use it as a mask to bring in color. Which I guess we might as well just do color while we're here. So yeah, from this directional warp, we're going to bring it through a gradient map. I'm not using the gradient editor, simply because I found it to be too difficult in this case. So instead I'm using 2 uniform color nodes, and I'm just blending, what the output of the gradient map on top of the uniform color nodes. And I'm using overlay at about half opacity. That turns out pretty okay. I mean, that's more or less what I'm going for. And we'll do something a little bit later on to bring in a bit more detail. And then what I'm doing is I'm blending them back together using that mask I told you about before. And that's the basis of our color. That's, I guess, the first step. And then we're going to go into the wear color. So for the wear color, I brought in this kind of desaturated beige, kind of dark gray. And what I've done is I've just blended it on top of the previous node using copy at like 33% opacity. And then what I'm doing here is I'm using this mask from Blur High Quality Grayscale, and I adjusted the levels. I clamped it down so it wouldn't be. Okay, yeah. So it would get brighter, and what that's doing is it's giving us like more of like a gradiated area, like a transition kind of effect with this wear color, which I think looks pretty good. And then we're going to go on to our like subcarpet color. So I've just taken from the slope blur grayscale, I've just taken it into a gradient map, and I've just given it like some random brownish kind of colors. And what I've done here is I wanted these middle bits here to be like almost completely transparent. Actually, there we go. I wanted this to be a little bit transparent because I wanted like a little bit of the color to come through from the bottom. But I also wanted the middle bits, which I should do now. I forgot to do before. I wanted them to be somewhat transparent. Yeah, something like this. There we go. And then I'm just running this through a HSL node to kind of desaturate it a little bit. Probably don't have to do this. Probably could do it in the gradient editor, but oh well. And then I'm blending it on top with copy. And I'm using, again, this blur high quality grayscale. I'm adjusting the levels. I'm clamping it like way up. and then I'm using that as an opacity mask, and this is what we get. And then, as I said, we're gonna add in a bit more of that detail, and to do that, I'm going to just go through some other things first. I'm going to go through our height, and basically our height is just the output from our warp node here. I'm taking it through a histogram scan, and then I'm taking it through histogram range, and then I'm outputting height. The reason I'm going through a histogram range is because this height map would be really crazy. If you think about it, like this subcarpet and this carpet, it's probably only like a millimeter between the two, maybe 2 millimeters. And so, like, if you think about it, like this white, this light color is really high and this dark color is really low. You know, there's probably like, this height map is probably like, I don't know, maybe like half a meter between the two. That doesn't make sense. So, you know, we get rid of a lot of that, and, you know, we bring it down a bit, which makes more sense. So then, also we're just going to do the normal over here. From this histogram scan, we're just going into a levels. I'm not doing anything with the levels, but it's just for tweaking if you want. And then I'm bringing it into a normal, and with the intensity like really low. If you go really high, it gets a bit noisy. I'll show you what I mean. For me, that's like too much. You know, that's too noisy on the carpet. I mean, some people maybe that's the look you're going for. I guess half, 0.5 is all right, but I really like 0.25. I think that's probably ideal for me. So that's our normal map done, and you can just output that. And then what I'm doing here is I brought in a curvature and a curvature smooth. What I'm doing is I'm blending them together with add sub on a pretty low opacity. And so what I'm using that for is I'm running that through a gradient map, and I'm blending that back on top of our diffuse. And so what that does is it just kind of brings up the contrast in a lot of these smaller details. And I find that in most cases, not all cases, this really helps. You know, it really helps materials kind of pop. It gives the diffuse like a pop. It's a lot better than, like, I see a lot of people who take like the AO and they'll blend that on top of the diffuse layer, and I don't really like that because that's more or less just baking. It's just like baking information onto the diffuse, which you can do it. It isn't ideal, but this method is better because it's more of just like a contrast adjustment rather than like actual baking. I found that like half is about right. I mean, you could go all the way, but it's pretty. It's pretty extreme. You know, but you can play around and decide like what you think looks well. It depends on your scene and everything too. So from there, we're going to get into dirt. I have 3 dirts that I'm doing with this one, and our first dirt is going to be dirt 2, which isn't too crazy, isn't too noisy. The default node by itself is actually pretty good, and I'm just running that through levels, and then I'm taking it into a gradient map. I did use the gradient editor this time, and what I've done here is on this black key. I had to remember what they were called. This black key, I've taken the alpha all the way down to 0, and this essentially makes everything that's black transparent. So that's cool. And then it just made that kind of like a dirt brown kind of color. And obviously I've left the white almost completely opaque. I've made it just like a tiny bit transparent. And what I found actually with the gradient editor, when you're doing like things like dirt and other things, actually you get a really cool effect if you make the black a lighter color and the white like a darker color. I found that works really well. And I can actually show you. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Invert positions? Is that? No, that's not going to do what I want. Okay, well, you just take my word for it on that one. So yeah, that's going through a gradient map that I just explained. Then I'm bringing that in an HSL node, and I'm just desaturating it a bit. Again, I could probably do it in the gradient map, but I will. And then I'm blending that on top with opacity set to like I think it's set to about half using copy. And so because this dirt node is also going to be blended into our gloss map, I've exposed the two opacity sliders for these blend nodes. So if I want to increase the dirt amount in the diffuse, it'll be also increased in the gloss map. And you can see I did that like here. Yeah, I did it about half opacity. It looks about right to me. Okay, so the next two dirts are like pretty much the same, but I'll just walk you through them anyways. What I'm doing is I'm doing a directional warp, and I'm using, well, directional noise. And then for our intensity input, I'm actually using that curvature blend on a pretty strong intensity, like 60 something, and then just at like a random warp angle. And so what that's doing is that is actually warping our directional noise in the pattern that the carpet is. So what's really cool about that is we can then run that through a histogram scan and then through a gradient map and kind of make it look like some dirt and blend it on top. It's a really subtle, I don't want to like go crazy with this effect. I kept it really subtle, but I'll crank it up just so I can kind of exemplify like what it does. But as you can see, it kind of like, it's like people are like kicking around dirt in a direction. Like the direction of traffic on this carpet is maybe like this way. Let's just imagine. And what's really cool is this dirt looks like it's been worn in. It really looks like it's been walked over and people have been like, stepping on it and stuff like that. But as I said, I like it. It's like more of a subtle effect. So I keep it at about half opacity. So for our final dirt, I'm using Grunge Map 14. I hate to use grunge maps because like the compute cost is really high and they can be kind of really noisy and hard to work with. But this one worked out pretty okay. And I'm just running it through a gradient editor again. And again, I'll just show you this. I've taken the black key and I've set the alpha to 0 and like a light brown. And this I've set to like a dark, like a mid brown. Not that it matters because I'm running it through an HSL node. But before that, I'm going to run it through a directional warp. And again, we're going to use the curvature blend in our directional warp through an HSL node, as I said, and blend it on top. And again, I think this one is like, again, about half opacity, 0.31 opacity. This one is easy to go overkill with. I guess maybe if it's like a post-apocalyptic office, it would be pretty dirty, pretty roughed up. You could do something like this, but if you go like all the way, it's too much. So for my own taste, I keep it at like 0.3. I'm pretty happy with that. And then finally, a final HSL node. You can tell I really love them. And then output to diffuse. I'll just talk about AO while we're here. So from our curvature blend, I'm just going through an ambient inclusion and then outputting AO output. I find that this is a pretty simple, kind of a quick and dirty method for getting AO. For our specular map, we're just using uniform color at like a pretty dark gray. And for our metallic, obviously there's no metallic, so we're just outputting like a gray. And I could actually, well, no, I'll keep those at 248. I was thinking I could crank them down to like 16 by 16, but oh well. Okay, so finally we're going to go through the gloss map. It can also function as a roughness map. I've shown in the end here. But okay, I'm starting with uniform color. Again, like a dark gray. I felt that this gray was about right. You don't want it to be like too bright. And just to remind you guys, if you don't know, like with the gloss workflow, dark means like it won't reflect light. So the darker something is, the less light it reflects. And the lighter something is, the more light it reflects. So for me, this is about right for carpet. It isn't like totally black. It reflects a little bit of light. Some of the fibers are shiny, and that's what I tried to do with this node. And so I'm taking the large, from the large warp, directional warp node, I'm blending that on top of that gray. about copy, about 0.4. You know, you can kind of crank it up if you think like maybe it's more of a glossy carpet. I don't know, but 0.4 is about right for me. And so what we're doing then is we're taking this levels from dirt 1 and we're blending it with subtract on top. And obviously dirt is pretty black, so you know it's not going to reflect any light, so that matches. And then we're doing the same thing with this dirt 2, blending it with subtract again, and then dirt 3 exactly the same. We're blending it on top with subtract. And as I said, I've exposed these opacity sliders to match with their diffuse opacity sliders. And so when you adjust one, the other gets adjusted, and everything makes sense. And then I'm just outputting to an output node for glossiness. And then since roughness is the inverse of gloss, I've just inverted grayscale and outputted a roughness node. So I think that about covers it. I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. It's my first video tutorial for making, well, anything. So I hope I didn't go too fast and I explained everything that I needed to explain. Let me know if you liked this or you didn't like this. You know, I hope this helps. I hope you guys can learn something, especially for you people like starting off as Substance Designer. I know for me it was like really hard to get into it because I couldn't really find good resources. You know, I found like a lot of breakdowns and people like going through things like through screenshots and stuff like that. But for me, that didn't really work, and I wanted like a lot more videos. So I decided to like make one, and hopefully it helps someone. So thanks for watching, guys.